Hey everybody, this is a piece by Andreas Benl. It's titled Cultural Relativism and Antisemitism, History, Encounters, and Consequences of Ethno-Religious Identity Politics in the Orient and the West. Let's rock. Right-wing populist identity politicians and left liberal multiculturalists seem to agree on one thing: the chaos in the Middle East and religious political struggles in Western migration societies are essentially a clash between static cultures. While right-wing populist identity politicians see restrictions on Muslim immigration as a magic cure against Islamist terrorism, the latter, left liberal multiculturalists, define political Islam as the identity of all Muslims and the headscarf for women as its main and most important symbol. Since the revolution in Iran in 1979, political Islam has become a global political power factor. It was more successful than other ethno-religious movements, such as European fascism and National Socialism, in presenting itself as an authentic expression of the values of certain societies, their so-called, quote, cultural difference, end quote. In this essay, I argue that this relative, quote, success, end quote, is not just a result of the victory of political Islam in Iran, but that it is also related to the emergence of a new ideological trend in the West. I will outline the history of the development and its determinants, the interconnection between Western cultural relativism and its Eastern counterparts, Islamism, and its identitarian intellectual predecessors and fellow travelers. Particularly interesting as a vanishing point is the transformation of traditional European anti-Semitism tabooed in the Cold War that took place in this development, and the role played by anti-Zionism as a common denominator of cultural relativism and Islamism. Finally, an outlook will shed light on the current constellation between the West and the Orient, as well as Iran, Israel, and its Arab neighbors. This outlook will also allude to present and future conflict lines and possible alliances in the confrontation with Islamism and despotism. New section, quote, Islam is desirable, ... for other people, end quote. Cultural relativism is the antithesis to ethical, political, and sociological universalism. According to cultural relativism, cultures are to be understood only from culture's own values and culture's own history. The 18th century German philosopher Johann Gottfried Herder could be seen as one of its founding fathers, opposing the universalism of the Enlightenment by stressing the cultural particularities of every nation. Herder refused the evolving theories of races and their differences, but his approach served as a basis for conservative cultural theories. After World War II, the cultural relativist approach was defined as opposed to German and European ethnocentrism and racism. In 1952, Claude Lévi-Strauss wrote the book Race and History for UNESCO. So I was trying to look that up. But if you're interested, Race and History by Claude Lévi-Strauss is for free on the internet. Obviously, this piece is probably critical of that book, and I would be too. In probability, I have no idea of its content, so I'm talking out my hiney. But anyway, in this book, Claude Lévi-Strauss rejected the idea of different races, but at the same time condemned the self-understanding of the European Enlightenment, which in his eyes looked down on other cultures. Quote, modern man, ... attempts, end bracket, to account for the diversity of cultures while seeking, at the same time, to eradicate what still shocks and offends him in that diversity. End quote. Claude Lévi-Strauss, Race and History. Since then, cultural relativist theories have evolved mainly within the academic sphere of postmodern theories in cultural and gender studies and within the new social movement since the 1970s. Though opposed to biological determinism, cultural relativism tends to transform the discourse of race into a cultural determinism, legitimizing contested cultural practices like, for example, the Islamic burqa as authentic expressions of the diversity of cultures. Footnote: Judith Butler, for example, stated, quote, "The burqa can be a way of negotiating shame and sexuality in a public sphere, of preserving a woman's honor, and even a way of resisting certain Western modes of dress that signify a full encroachment of fashion and commodity dress that signifies the cultural efforts to efface Islamic practice," end quote. Judith Butler, in a piece titled "Feminism Should Not Resign in the Face of Such Instrumentalization," interviewed by R. Zolbach, end footnote. Thinkers of the extreme right, like the French writer Alain de Benoist, I don't know if I'm not saying the guy's names right. It looks like Benoist, but I know that's not how you pronounce it. Have tried to capitalize on cultural relativism, coining the term, quote, ethno-pluralism, end quote, and legitimizing ethno-religious segregation of different cultures with the supposed equal rights. Footnote: see T. Baron. Its article, Alain de Benoist. Again, fucking that up. Neo-fascism with the human face. Why am I struggling with this? Why don't I just look it up? Stop being a lazy little pee-pee. French to English.
Alain de Benoist.
Alain de Benoist. The political constellation that I try to depict here is unique and complex. While Islamists and other ethno-religious fundamentalists speak in their own name and that of their supposed culture, Western cultural relativists are speaking in the name of the, quote, other, or even of the, quote, others, even if the, quote, others protest against being subsumed under a certain culture or identity. A controversy from the late 1970s can serve as an illustration of this constellation. In 1978, a polemic broke out between Michel Foucault and an Iranian writer living in Paris. The first of many following controversies in which Oriental freethinkers were and are criticized by Western liberals or leftists for a supposed hatred of Islam. Foucault had just written a series of articles about the nascent revolution in Iran, in which Foucault strongly favored the Islamist current of the revolutionaries. An Iranian woman with the pseudonym Atusa H. wrote in response to Foucault's enthusiasm from the perspective of a future Islamic government in Iran and life under Sharia law. It's, quote, "It seems to me that the Western left lacks humanism. Islam is desirable, for other people. Many Iranians are, like me, distressed and desperate about the thought of a, quote, Islamic government, The Western liberal left needs to know that Islamic law can become a dead weight on societies hungering for change. The left should not let itself be seduced by a cure that is perhaps worse than the disease," end quote. Atusa H. Foucault wrote in a short reply published in the magazine Nouvelle Observateur a week later that the, quote, intolerable, end quote, in Attusa H's letter was that it, quote, merges together all the aspects, all the forms, and all the potentialities of Islam within a single expression of contempt, end quote. Foucault concluded by lecturing Attusa H that, quote, in order to approach it, bracket Islam, and bracket, with a minimum of intelligence, the first condition is not to begin by bringing in hatred, end quote. Foucault. Apparently that article that response by Attusa H, an Iranian woman writes, is featured in Foucault and the Iranian Revolution, Gender and the Seductions of Islamism, edited by J. Afari and Kevin B. Anderson. Kevin B. Anderson, of course, being an important proponent of Marxist humanism in the tradition of Raya Dunayevskaya. I have a couple pieces, I think, by Kevin Anderson on this channel. I have at least one, which is like one of the first secondary sources about the life of Raya Dunayevskaya and kind of like a summary of some of her ideas. Anyway, Foucault's response is also in Foucault and the Iranian Revolution book. Moving on. Foucault's arguments may seem familiar from the current debate on so-called Islamophobia and would hardly produce public outcry today. However, following the revolution in Iran, Ayatollah Ruhollah Khomeini's terror campaign against women, homosexuals, and political opponents in 1979 mobilized prominent figures such as Simone de Beauvoir against the new regime in Iran and brought harsh criticism from other leftist intellectuals against Foucault. One of them that's important, and I don't know if it's going to be was it Kate Millett? Was one of the people who were outspoken critics of the regime. In its early period, not just later. The renowned Marxist Orientalist Maxime Rodinson warned of Islamism as a kind of, quote, archaic fascism, end quote, and compared Khomeini's concept of an Islamic government with the Spanish Inquisition. Without mentioning Foucault, Maxime Rodinson spoke of, quote, Europeans convinced of the vices of Europe and hoping to find elsewhere, parenthesis, why not in Islam, in parenthesis, the means of assuring a more or less radiant future, end quote. Maxime Rodinson. Former Maoist Jacques and Claudie Breuil accused Foucault of honoring a murderous regime. I don't know if that's not Bernard Levy. Bernard Levy, I know. I guess these aren't that's not who that is, but what's it? I think it's Benny Levy. I can't remember his name, but he's like one of those new philosophers. I think he's kind of conservative, politically, but one of those people who kind of was like a follower, like a Maoist, and then kind of reverted to his old name. It kind of became something like one of the new philosophers in France. I don't know how to say it. Never mind. Forget what I'm saying. Anyway, moving on. Actually, let me check and see if these people are anybody. Jacques and Claudie Breuil. And their critique of Foucault is also in Anderson's book. I didn't know that was Afari and Anderson, I should say. I didn't know that Afari and Anderson's book, I've never looked at it myself, I did not know that it was a collection of primary sources. I should read it. During the remaining years of the Cold War, and in part In the following decade, the attitude of many Western intellectuals toward Islamist terror and the Iranian regime remained critical. In 1989, at the so-called Rushdie affair, Khomeini's death fatwa against the British writer for his book Satanic Verses sent shockwaves through European capitals. This event marks a turning point. Initially, many liberal and leftist intellectuals showed their solidarity with Salman Rushdie, while mainstream media and institutions often hesitated and imposed realpolitik over freedom of speech. I don't know if there's a quote on there's no quote here, but there's a citation for Kenan Malik, From Fatwa to Jihad, the Rushdie Affair and its Legacy. But Khomeini's fatwa also challenged the leftist self-image. During the Cold War, the Western New Left had declared its solidarity even with the most regressive national liberation movements, but always in the name of universal values. The particular should only be the form of universalistic content. Now Khomeini formulated an attack on freedom of expression in the name of Islamic particularism. The form became the content. With the collapse of so-called, quote, real socialism, unquote, in Eastern Europe, Islamism began its ideological expansion in the West, fusing a particularist ideology with the remnants of anti-imperialism, anti-Americanism, and anti-Zionism. New section. From Oriental cultural relativism to Islamism as a form of anti-modern modernity. In many societies shaped by the religion of Islam, attempts were made in the first decades of the 20th century to separate religion and state. Especially in Turkey and Iran, secularism was practiced as a state mission from above. In Iran after 1905, there had been a liberal bourgeois revolution that demanded the separation of religion and state. At that time, religious figures who resisted secularization were clearly in retreat. The Islamic clergy proved to be flexible in order to preserve its influence. The prominent Shiite cleric, Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani, first allied with the modernist monarch Reza Shah Pahlavi, was arrested by the British occupying forces in World War II as an enemy of the anti-Hitler coalition, briefly supported the reformist anti-imperialist Mohammad Mossadegh in the early 1950s, then forged an alliance with Reza Pahlavi's son, Mohammad Reza, to overthrow Mossadegh. Ayatollah Abul Qasim Kashani, political foster son, Ruhollah Khomeini, only broke with Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi in the early 1960s, when the monarch introduced a land reform and women's suffrage. Wikipedia says Syed Abul Qasim Mostafavi Kashani lived from 1882 to 1962 and was an Iranian politician and Shia Marja. Abul Qasim Kashani played an important role in the 1953 coup in Iran and the overthrow of Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh. Khomeini never shared the modernist goals of the Shah's liberal and left-wing opponents in Persia, but he eventually gained a reputation among secular anti-imperialists who were frustrated with the failure of Mossadegh. These intellectuals had barely done a thorough and critical analysis of the role of religion in Iranian history and were thus vulnerable to the idea of an Islamic reformulation of their agenda. Khomeini also introduced anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism as religious political propaganda tools. In the 1960s and 1970s, Khomeini did not endorse the propagandistic distinction later made by him and many Islamists between Jews and Zionists. Khomeini speculated whether the Shah was a Jew because of the good relations between Iran and Israel. In the introduction to his most important work, The Islamic State from 1970, he presents the Jews as conspirators against Islam. Footnote. See Khomeini, Islam and Revolution, Writings and Declarations of Imam Khomeini. And footnote. While Khomeini eventually became the charismatic leader of Islamism, two Iranian intellectuals built bridges for the transformation from secular to religious anti-imperialism and cultural relativism in the 1960s and 1970s. One of them was ex-member of the Communist Today Party, Jalal Ahmad, with his essay Garb Zadegi from 1962. Garb Zadegi has been translated as, quote, West toxification, quote, Occidentosis, or, quote, plague from the West, end quote. Wikipedia says Syed Jalal al-Ahmad, who lived from 1923 to 1969, was a prominent Iranian novelist, short story writer, translator, philosopher, socio-political critic, sociologist, as well as an anthropologist who was, quote, one of the earliest and most prominent of contemporary Iranian ethnographers, end quote. Syed popularized the term Garb Zadegi, variously translated in English as, quote, Western struck, quote, West toxification, quote, Occidentosis, producing a holistic ideological critique of the West, quote, which combined strong themes of Frantz Fanon and Marx, end quote. Whose quote is this? Emery C. Bogle, Islam, Origin and Belief. That's where that quote is from. Back to the text. In this essay, Jalal al-Ahmad condemns an alleged cultural colonization of Iranian society by Western capitalism, which Jalal al-Ahmad sees as the soulless creature of the machine. Islam is being introduced as a possible means of resisting this development, albeit less at a theological or spiritual level, but rather instrumentally as part of a cultural empowerment for modernizing the East, in concert with other emerging Eastern countries to counter Western capitalism. Cultural relativism serves here as a kind of metapolitical foundation of an Oriental anti-universalist anti-imperialism. In the foreword of the book, he refers to the German nationalist revolutionary writer Ernst Jünger. Al-Ahmad apparently saw the German pre-fascist writer as a soulmate for an Oriental conservative revolution because of his anti-liberal and anti-Western writings. Footnote. See Al-Ahmad, Occidentosis, A Plague from the West, published in 1983, page 25. It may come as a surprise that Al-Ahmad traveled to Israel in 1963 and wrote an enthusiastic report. Footnote. See Al-Ahmad's book, The Israeli Republic, An Iranian Revolutionary's Journey to the Jewish State. End footnote. The re-release of excerpts in the run-up to the nuclear deal with the Islamic Republic caused quite a stir. Footnote. For example, in B.C.B. Vishai's article, Among the Believers, what Jalal al-Ahmad thought Iranian Islamism could learn from Zionism, published in Foreign Affairs, 2014. End footnote. On the one hand, the work has been interpreted as the glimpse of a possible understanding between Iranian reformist Islamists and the State of Israel. Footnote. See E. Schumann's article, The Israeli Republic of Iran, on a book by a Persian writer who viewed the Jewish state as entirely harmonious with the Islamic Republic, published in Times of Israel, 10th of April, 2014. End footnote. Others saw in Ali Ahmad's admiration of the state of Israel a symptom of Persian anti-Arab nationalism and evidence of the similarity of the Israeli state to the Iranian theocracy. Footnote. See A. Shams' article, Next Year in Tehran, an Iranian intellectual's trip to Israel in the 1960s revealed the strange appeal of secular republicanism to religious ethno-supremacists, published in The New Inquiry in 2014. End footnote. But for Ali Ahmad, Israel was above all an ideological projection surface for his supposed entry into modernity with no or reduced Western influence, a similar fantasy product as Islam as a vehicle for an autonomous development, supposedly a religious guardian state, and at the same time a socialist utopia. This was an image that the real state of Israel could never match. This is why Ali Ahmad, after the Six-Day War of 1967, changed fronts in favor of the, quote, Palestinian cause, unquote, with equal ease as many intellectuals in Western Germany. The travelogue was published in 1984 by Ali Ahmad's brother, Shams, in the Islamic Republic of Iran. At the end of the report, there is an anonymous anti-Zionist tirade with anti-Semitic undertones from 1967, according to Shams, a text by Jalal Ali Ahmad. Ali Ahmad's quest for meaning is in some sense reminiscent of the tourism of revolutionaries by Western leftists to third world countries, the difference being that his writings were the forerunner of the Islamist future of Iranian society, not only a reflection of the, quote, culture of the other, end quote, enjoyed from a distance by Western intellectuals. The political price of ideological fantasies in Iran was much higher than in the West. The sociologist Ali Shariati added anti-imperialist dynamic to the cultural critique of Jalal Ali Ahmad. Wikipedia says, Ali Shariati Matsinani, who lived from 1933 to 1977, was an Iranian revolutionary and sociologist who specialized in the sociology of religion. Ali Shariati Mazinani is regarded as one of the most influential Iranian intellectuals of the 20th century. Ali Shariati Mazinani is regarded as, has been referred to as the, quote, ideologue of the Islamic Revolution, end quote, although Ali Shariati Mazinani's ideas did not ultimately serve as the foundation for the Islamic Republic. Back to the text. Ali Shariati criticized the conservative, quietist tradition of Islam and it offered a social revolutionary reinterpretation of Islamic history. From Ali Shariati's studies in Paris, Ali Shariati knew Jean-Paul Sartre's existentialism and the anti-colonial writings of Frantz Fanon. At the same time, Ali Shariati was a fierce critic of Marxism, which Ali Shariati saw as the culmination of humanist, quote, Western fallacies, end quote. Footnote, see the book Ali Shariati's book, Marxism and Other Western Fallacies, an Islamic Critique. End footnote. While Jalal alay Ahmad used Islam as a tool for the alleged return to Oriental cultural heritage, Shariati, on the other hand, defined the desire for, quote, authentic cultural values, end quote, as a bridge to Islam, which Ali Shariati saw as the only possible savior of these values. Ali Shariati's work, Hajj, defines sacrifice and martyrdom as central values of a revolutionary Islam that is opposed to the, quote, alienation of mankind, end quote, through consumerism and worldly rationalist thinking. In his essay, Fatima is Fatima, from 1971, Ali Shariati criticizes the traditional role of women at home and hearth on the one hand, and feminist individual, quote, Western emancipation on the other hand. Instead, women should have the opportunity to be active members of society, but only if they are willing to do so as female soldiers of Islam and join the fight against an imagined Western cultural invasion. Khomeini had more specific problems as the practitioner of the Islamic Revolution, since Khomeini had to prove that an Islamic state based on the religious laws of the Quran was a possibility of the 20th century. Khomeini mocked the idea of secular Iranians that Islamists are opposed to the technological achievements of modernity. On the contrary, they should rather be used for the establishment of Islamic theocracy. While the Nazis reenacted the dynamics of capital as a social Darwinist racial war and anti-Semitic rage, Islamism at first sight seems to mean a total stagnation and rejection of history since the era of Muhammad, but with the concept of Velayat-e-Faqih, the guardianship of the Islamic jurist, Khomeini introduced a major innovation. Centrality shifts from sacred texts to religious leaders as mediators between God and the masses. In a Machiavellian turn, Khomeini said that in the event of a state of emergency, the religious leader could even suspend religious tradition and Sharia law. Wikipedia says, when I looked up this word, again, let me read it. Velayat-e-Faqih. What comes up is the guardianship of the Islamic jurist. Velayat-e-Faqih is a concept in 12er Shia Islamic law, which holds that until the reappearance of the, quote, infallible imam, end quote, sometime before Judgment Day, the religious and social affairs of the Muslim world should be administered by righteous Shiite jurists, faqih. The nature of these affairs is disputed. Vilayat el-Faqih is associated in particular with Ruhollah Khomeini and the Islamic Republic of Iran. In a series of lectures in 1970, Khomeini advanced the idea of guardianship in its, quote, absolute, end quote, form as rule of the state and society. This version of guardianship now forms the basis of the Constitution of the Islamic Republic of Iran, which calls for a guardian jurist to serve as the supreme leader of that country. Currently, this role is held by Ayatollah Khamenei. Always struggle to pronounce that guy's name. Under the, quote, absolute authority of the jurist, end quote, Velayat-e-Matlaqai-Faqih, the jurist / faqih has control over all public matters, including governance of states, all religious affairs, including the temporary suspension of religious obligations, such as the Salat prayer or Hajj pilgrimage. Obedience to him is more important. according to proponents, and in performing those religious obligations. Other Shia Islamic scholars disagree, with some limiting guardianship to a much narrower scope, things like mediating disputes and providing guardianship for orphan children, the mentally incapable, and others lacking someone to protect their interests. There is disagreement over how widely supported Khomeini's doctrine is, that is, whether, quote, the absolute authority and guardianship, end quote, of a high-ranking Islamic jurist is, quote, universally accepted amongst all Shia theories of governance, end quote, and forms, quote, a central pillar of Imami Shiite political thought, end quote. And those quotes are from Ahmed Vaezi and Taki Yazdi. Or whether there is no consensus in favor of the model of the Islamic Republic of Iran, neither among the public in Iran, Ali Reza Nader, or whether there is no consensus in favor of the model of the Islamic Republic of Iran, neither among the public in Iran, nor among religious leaders in the leading centers of Shia thought, such as Qom and Najaf. Back to the text. Footnote. Quote, in a letter to then President Khomeini, Khomeini stated, quote, the government has the right to unilaterally terminate its religious contracts with the people if those contracts are against the interests of the country and Islam. The government has the right to prevent anything, whether related to religious rituals or not, as long as it is against the interest of Islam. The Hajj, bracket, pilgrimage, in bracket, which is one of the important religious tasks, can be prevented temporarily by the government if it regards it against the expediency of the Islamic Republic, end quote. Khomeini emphasized that if a ruling jurist had to make decisions based on Islamic law, the religious government and its absolute authority would be meaningless. Therefore, the ruling jurist is not necessarily the jurist who understands Islamic law better than other ones, but he is the jurist who has the ability and authority to understand the interest of Islam and the Islamic Republic beyond the sacred text of Islamic law, end quote. M. Kalaji, Apocalyptic Politics on the Rationality of Iranian Policy. End footnote. Here Islam is less a term of a religious and more of a political theology, reminiscent of the terms of the crown jurist of the Third Reich, Carl Schmitt. Schmitt had defined the political sphere as a distinction between friend and enemy, and sovereign power as the authority that decides on the state of emergency. In the Islamic Republic, this is the religious leader commissioned by God, even more important than the religious laws or the definition of the content of a particular religious orthodoxy, is the identification of metaphysical enemies. On top of the list are Jews, Zionism, and the State of Israel. Only a few months after taking power in the summer of 1979, Khomeini introduced the Quds/Jerusalem Day and declared, quote, Quds Day is an international day. Quds Day is not a day devoted to Quds alone. Quds Day is the day for the weak and oppressed to confront the arrogant powers, the day for those nations suffering under the pressure of American oppression and oppression by other powers to confront the superpowers. It is the day when the oppressed should arm themselves against the oppressors and rub their noses in the dirt. It is the day when the hypocrites will be distinguished from the true believers. For the true believers acknowledge this day as Quds Day and do what they must do. The hypocrites, however, those who are secretly affiliated with the superpowers and are friends of Israel, are either indifferent on this day or do not allow the people to hold demonstrations, end quote. Khomeini. Footnote. That's from Cud's Day is the day for the weak and oppressed to confront the oppressors. End footnote. Khomeini tried to establish a global Muslim duty to gather against Israel and the West, merging anti-imperialist oppressor versus oppressed rhetoric with Islamist anti-Zionism. In this way, Khomeini wanted to create a clear-cut separation between the, quote, true Muslims, end quote, who rise up against Israel, and those who have been denounced as infidels and traitors in the Muslim world. Anti-Zionism has a similar importance as a guideline for the definition of friends and enemies in the foreign policy of the Islamic Republic, as anti-Semitism had as guiding principle for the enmity of Nazi Germany against Western democracies in the Soviet Union. New section, Dynamics of Cultural Relativism and Anti-Zionism During and After the End of the Cold War. In the 1960s, thinkers of anti-colonialism, such as Frantz Fanon, attempted to create a revolutionary culture of the oppressed against colonial oppressors. In his essay titled The Defeat of the Mind in 1987, the French philosopher Alain Finkielkraut criticized Fanon, claiming that his attempt to escape European philosophy had failed and only led him to German national romanticism, as advocated by Johann Gottfried Herder, who thought in closed, unchanging national cultural units. It is important to note that cultural relativist and anti-universalist postures remained controversial within the global left during the Cold War. Edward Said introduced the, quote, linguistic turn, and, quote, to anti-imperialism in 1978 with his book Orientalism. When he condemned Marx's writings on the Orient as part of Western imperialist, quote, Orientalism, Said was, for example, criticized by left-wing Syrian thinker Sadiq al-Azam for a, quote, an Orientalism in reverse, unquote. Apparently this text is available in LibCom. And Wikipedia says Sadiq Jalal al-Azam lived from 1934 to 2016 and was a professor emeritus of European philosophy at the University of Damascus in Syria, and was until 2007, a visiting professor in the Department of Near Eastern Studies at Princeton University. Sadiq Jalal al-Azam His main areas of specialization was the work of German philosopher Immanuel Kant, but he later placed a greater emphasis upon the Islamic world and its relationship to the West, evidenced by his contribution to the discourse of Orientalism. Al-Azam was also known as a human rights advocate and a champion of intellectual freedom and free speech. Back to the text. Al-Azam accused Said of turning negative Western stereotypes about the Orient into an affirmed entity of, quote, the other, end quote. Since the attacks of 9/11, the panorama has changed. We are hardly talking anymore about a plurality of cultures seen as static entities, but of a dualism. The West against Islam or Islamism. While it was possible to try to mix ethnology and Marxism in the anti-colonial and anti-imperialist movements during the Cold War, this is no more conceivable after 1989, and even less after 9/11. The competition is no more between two secular universalist alliances competing around the worldly terms of the French Revolution. freedom on the one hand, equality on the other. There is no alternative economic system like the former Eastern Bloc, but only remaining oil rent states like Iran, Russia, and Venezuela challenging Europe and the United States. The focus of political competition between the great powers has shifted from Latin America and Asia to the Middle East. In the past, it was the Soviet Union which supported nationalist or religious anti-Western movements in the Third World on a tactical basis. Venezuela's socialism of the 21st century, on the contrary, is maintained with counterinsurgency assistance by Iranian Revolutionary Guards, not the other way around. Footnote. See J. Humeyer, Iran propping up Venezuela's repressive militias, published in the Washington Times, 2014. Within this political ideological dynamic, anti-Zionism gets to the center of the stage. An anti-Zionist attitude was not always prevalent in the left. Socialist labor Zionism once was the strongest current within the Jewish national movement. Lenin and the Bolsheviks saw the Zionists initially as competitors within the orbit of the workers' movement. Footnote. See Polyakov's From Anti-Zionism. Vom Antisemitismus zum Antisemitismus. End footnote. In 1947, the Soviet Union was even very supportive of the creation of a Jewish state, hoping it would form an alliance with the USSR. Footnote. See A. Gromyko's remarks by Soviet Minister Andrei Gromyko to the UN Special Committee on Palestine, 14th of May, 1947. End footnote. See also M. Kramer's Who Saved Israel in 1947, published in Mosaic Magazine, 2017. The attitude changed dramatically once Stalin's hopes to gain new satellite states in Israel proved futile. Soviet anti-Zionist agitation now adopted a paranoid anti-Semitic tone. Zionism was no more seen as a political adversary, but as an international Jewish conspiracy against the, quote, socialist camp, end quote, with deadly consequences for the victims who were persecuted in show trials in communist Eastern Europe in the 1950s. The Soviet Union flooded the Middle East and other countries with anti-Zionist propaganda. This attitude did not change until its dissolution in 1991. Footnote. See the article by M. Polomino, Soviet Union, The Doctor's Plot, 1953, Stalin's Last Purge Plan, published in the Encyclopedia Judaica, Volume 6. See also I. Tabarovsky's Understanding the Real Origin of the New York Times cartoon, Anti-Semitic Soviet Propaganda Informs Contemporary Left Anti-Zionism. End footnote. In contrast, among the post-war New Left, there were intense feelings of solidarity with the Jewish state, whose creation was seen in the context of the struggle against Nazism, and this left, quote, regarded Great Britain and the feudal Arab monarchies as the imperialists and the reactionaries of the Middle East, end quote. See Susie Linfield, Zionism and the Left, an interview with Susie Linfield, conducted by Alan Johnson in Fathom Journal. I have a piece by Susie Linfield on this channel about Aber Memi. End footnote. Especially in West Germany, in this there are strong sympathies among leftist students for the Jewish state, which is seen as a consequence of the Nazi past. That changed with the Six-Day War in 1967, when Western leftists discovered the Palestinians as part of the international anti-imperialist struggle in the framework of their opposition to the Vietnam War. A deep hostility toward Israel was the least consequence. Leftist terrorist groups like the Tupamaros West, Berlin, the, quote, revolutionary cells, but also the Japanese, quote, Red Army faction, even perpetrated deadly attacks against Israeli and Jewish targets on their own or alongside Palestinian armed groups. Footnote. See T. Fichter's Antisemitism of the 68ers. Philip Gessler and Stefan Reinicke talk with Tilman Fichter about the bomb planted in Berlin's Jewish Community Center in 1969. Footnote. See the article, Wanted Japanese Red Army Member Maintains 1972 Airport Attack Wasn't Terrorism. And footnote. Footnote. Jeffrey Herf, Undeclared Wars with Israel, East Germany, and the West German Far Left, 1967 to 1989. Wikipedia says Kozo Okamoto, born 1947, is a Japanese communist and member of the Japanese Red Army, responsible for the massacre of 26 passengers at Ben Gurion International Airport in Israel. And footnote. After the end of the Soviet bloc in 1989/1991, for a significant part of the global radical left, anti-Zionism is a kind of surrogate of the former global contention between Western capitalism and so-called real socialism. For liberal multiculturalists, the conflict between Israel and Palestine embodies all the perceived injustices committed by the West against the Oriental, quote, other. A closer look makes it possible to identify a history within the history, dating back to before the Cold War and beyond the orbit of the left. The solidarity with the Palestinian struggle in Western European societies is formulated in relation to the colonial or fascist past of the respective countries. While in France and in Britain, anti-Zionism rose in the realm of anti-imperialist and post-colonial concepts, in Germany and Austria it has been regularly associated with the German past. To overcome the Nazi past is seen as an obligation, not for solidarity with the Jewish state, but with Palestinian anti-Zionism of the alleged, quote, victims of the victims, end quote. Footnote. Austrian scholar Claudia Brunner has also written a very emotional account of her reworking of the genocidal Nazi past of her grand-uncle, Alois Brunner. In the end, she tries to explain the shift of her academic interest towards suicide bombers in the Middle East as a logical continuation of her interest in the history of Nazism and her, quote, close relationship with the family phantom, Alois Brunner, but just under different circumstances, end quote. Quote, in the course of research on the resistance of the Palestinians against the Israeli policy, I finally get back on a personal, emotional level to the dimension of the European/German/Austrian responsibility for the situation in the Middle East, a responsibility I cannot and want not to oversee within a historical perspective. End footnote. The British conservative historian Arnold J. Toynbee got to the heart of these attitudes when he accused the Jews of perpetrating political sins that the Europeans supposedly had left behind them after 1945. Toynbee claimed that the acts of violence committed by Zionists in the Israeli War of Independence resembled Nazi crimes. Footnote. See Y. Rosenberg's article, When an Israeli Ambassador Debated a British Historian, on Israel's legitimacy and won. End footnote. Toynbee claimed that acts of violence committed by Zionists in the Israeli War of Independence resembled Nazi crimes, and that the, quote, East European Zionists have been practicing colonialism in Palestine, at the very time when the West European peoples have been renouncing their temporary rule over non-European peoples, end quote. Arnold Toynbee, Experiences, published in 1969. New section. The transformation of the role of anti-Semitism in Europe and the Middle East. It seems easy to refute the absurdity of the anti-colonialist, anti-racist, and anti-fascist attitudes of academics or politicians who are trying to whitewash Islamism and anti-Zionism. In fact, the godfather of Palestinian anti-Zionism, the Mufti of Jerusalem, was not a classic anti-colonialist, much less an anti-fascist. Amin al-Husseini was first appointed by the British Mandate of Palestine, and later on he lived in Nazi Germany, where he was a fanatic supporter of Nazi anti-Semitism. After 1945, there was Western cooperation with Islamists in the Cold War. But these facts, suppressed by post-fascist and post-colonial anti-Zionism, lead to another question. What has changed in anti-Semitic articulation since the pre-Nazi era, and why? Max Horkheimer and Theodore W. Adorno in Dialectic of Enlightenment analyzed anti-Semitism as a blind and murderous ritual of the masses, a psychological compensation for the deprivations suffered by the underprivileged in a class society, and as a tool of cynical manipulation in the interest of the ruler. But the genocide committed by the Nazi national community transcends the traditional political and class boundaries. After Auschwitz, anti-Semitism in the West had lost anti-Semitism's, quote, good reputation, end quote. At the same time, however, the political panorama that had formed in the Dreyfus Affair, the dichotomy of right-wing extremist anti-Semites and liberal and left-wing enemies of anti-Semitism, was put into question. After 1945, when it became clear that anti-Semitism was a destructive force without borders, it became a taboo, at least in Western Europe and the United States, to affirm eliminationist anti-Semitism. A complicated political ideological division of labor emerged. Anti-Jewish Western intellectuals and politicians expressed understanding of genocidal ideologies as expressions of Palestinian or Muslim victims. Such an approach poses a much smaller political task to its protagonists, and if they had presented these ideologies an inherent anti-Semitism in their own name. For decades, the idea that Israel-Palestine is the mother of all conflicts has been so ingrained that the bloodbath of Assad and Assad's backers in Syria, which many on the left supported, from 2011 on, and the ascent of the, quote, Islamic State came as a surprise to many. Barack Obama's Cairo speech of June 2009 can serve as the culmination of a cultural relativism that under Obama's presidency became a state program. In this speech, Obama lamented headscarf bans, but not the compulsion to wear the headscarf. He emphasized the freedom of religion, but nowhere the right to be left in peace by religion. In addition, he defined American interventions in Israeli settlements as the main problems of the so-called Islamic world. It is therefore logical that Obama's dialogue with the Islamic world during his presidency narrowed to one with the Islamic Republic of Iran, to the profound horror of almost all of their neighbors. The Iranian regime is the only relevant state actor that ideologically accelerates as well as violently enforces anti-civilizational resentment, anti-Semitism, and religious community terror on a global level as state doctrine. In modern times, the Islamic world that Obama wanted to see, acknowledged in its supposed cultural essence, had never been unified beyond some shared anti-Western resentments, which today are enshrined in Tehran's slogans against the U.S. and Israel. The speech from Cairo was put to the test just a week later when an uprising in Iran started against the rulers of the Islamic Republic, the defenders of the compulsory hijab. The American president had equated the Iranian people and the leaders of the Islamic Republic. A conflict of life and death between the two was not foreseen. Against this background, both the U.S. government and the governments of the European Union denied any substantial political or even moral support for the democratic protest movement in Iran, which brought millions to the streets. It appeared as a threat to the envisioned nuclear deal with the mullahs. In the Middle East, modernist political movements after World War II and Israel's War of Independence almost immediately had shown a hybrid character that crossed left-wing anti-imperialism with an anti-Semitism which was formerly associated with the extreme right. Anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism became the common denominator and power instrument for Oriental despotisms of all kinds. The destruction of Israel was a central success parameter of Pan-Arabism and other post-colonial movements in the region. When this goal was not achieved, the rise of the Islamists was logical. The Islamists accused even the most inadequate and poorly organized advocacy of secular revolutionaries for social progress as a distraction from the war against the Jews in the West. The result was the preservation of the backwardness and devastation of the whole region. Footnote: Hisham Malem, Washington bureau chief of Al Arabiya News, writes, quote, "My generation of Arabs was told by the Arab nationalists and the Islamists that we should man the proverbial ramparts to defend the, quote, Arab world, and, quote, against the numerous barbarians, imperialist Zionist Soviets massing at the gates. Little did we know that the barbarians were already inside the gates, that they spoke our language and were already very well entrenched in the city." See also Hisham Melhem's article, "The Barbarians Within Our Gates, Arab Civilization Has Collapsed. It Won't Recover in My Lifetime," published in Politico magazine, 2014. End footnote. But this constellation has become precarious. For years, the most explicit and loudest critics of Islamism have been intellectuals in the Middle East or immigrants from an Oriental family background who had first-hand experience of Islamism. On the other hand, Islamism, which fused Islamic history with Western technology and elements of the anti-modern modernity of fascism and Nazism, has made the passage to Europe. There is no geographical separation between what is politically associated with the Orient and what is associated with the West anymore. The, quote, war of ideas no longer runs along, but on both sides of the borders. The catastrophic consequences of Western collaboration with the Iranian regime in recent years, the war in Syria, the rise of the, quote, Islamic State, have led to a new situation. Abandoned by the West, things are not looking good for Democrats and real moderates in the region, to say the least. However, this situation has increased enormously the pressure to challenge old dogmas on those who do not share the goals of the Islamists. While in the past anti-Zionism was treated as a regional folklore, independent of all other political differences, anti-Zionism's centrality is now clearly linked to the Iranian regime and its Sunni Islamist counterparts. Unfortunately, they have enough economic and military resources to continue their expansion, but their ideological hegemony over the region under the flag of a Muslim-Arab struggle against Israel has been put into question. To understand this, we must bear in mind, in order to preserve the reign of the, quote, axis of resistance, end quote, against Israel between Iran, Iraq, Lebanon, and Syria, I think you can include Russia in that as now, 500,000 Syrians had to die, and millions have been displaced. In the Middle East, therefore, there are even moments in which the self-destructive character of anti-Zionism comes to consciousness, be it among Syrian or Iraqi opposition figures, Middle Eastern freethinkers, or even with the leadership of Saudi Arabia. As an Iraqi TV presenter put it in a furious exchange with a Shiite militiaman, quote, "Palestine is not the cause of the Iraqis. We don't want that Iranian rhetoric," end quote. Today, one must decide whether one wants to help the Islamists to accomplish their work of destruction in the Middle East, or whether one wants to preserve what remains of the civilizational remnants of the societies in the region. Making Israel responsible for upheavals with which the Jewish state obviously has nothing to do is more difficult now than ever before. This development has culminated in the recent uprisings in Iran since New Year's Eve 2018. Its slogans against all the currents of the regime have been much more radical than in 2009. While at that time apologists for the regime claimed that the Iranian countryside is with the rulers, the protest against the regime's terrorist expansion has now been all over, with chants like, quote, "No to Gaza, no to Lebanon, my life only for Iran," end quote. Or, quote, "Let go of Syria, think of us," end quote. The religious cities of Mashhad and Qom, I don't know if I'm saying that right, became the focus of demonstrations against the Islamic Republic. Even the most holy slogans of the Iranian theocracy against the United States and Israel have been countered in the protests. In 2019, the protests in Iran were echoed by huge and enduring demonstrations in Lebanon and Iraq against the corruption of the ruling elite and the influence of the Islamic Republic on these societies. In summary, the political front lines have become much clearer in the last 5 to 10 years, and what Marx and Engels once described as a result of the historical ideological triumph of the European bourgeoisie now applies to a very different dramatic context: the disillusionment created by the chaos of the Middle East. Quote, "All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profane, and man is at last compelled to face with sober senses his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind," end quote. Thus the category of interest as a heroic driving force of the theory of revolution of Marx and Engels has been transformed into something else, a categorical imperative to prevent the worst. In the Middle East, the abyss between Islamists and other political forces is growing, but resources are lacking to successfully fight the Islamists. The paradoxical complement is the constellation in Germany, Europe, and to a certain degree also in the USA. The technologically most advanced societies of the Western world seem unable or unwilling to consider their own situation and their relationship with their southern neighbors soberly. It is increasingly difficult for Europeans to maintain the phantasm of the centrality of the Israel-Palestine conflict. But there is still no significant awareness of the fatal consequences to democracy and security in Europe of the creation of an Oriental fantasy world for the purpose of delegating anti-Semitic resentment. New section. From the European Civil War to the betrayal of solidarity and enlightenment in the name of the other, conflict lines and possible alliances. Between 1922 and 1945, bourgeois liberalism, socialism, communism, and fascism, Nazism constituted three political currents in changing mutual alliance constellations, which, however, ideologically represented only themselves. The identitarian self-image of the right-wing extremists to represent Europe's cultural heritage is only put forward by themselves. Attempts to forge alliances with them from the left and from the political center were easily identifiable as political opportunism. But the transformation of the Cold War confrontation into the masquerade ball of identities of recent decades has fundamentally changed traditional ideological constellations. while tough anti-imperialists defend Islamists as long as they serve their own anti-American and anti-Zionist needs. The academic left in particular has devised huge theoretical constructs in order to prove that to prove what the radical right also came to know. It is the cultural fate of the Muslim quote other to feel offended by the West and to sympathize with the Islamists. Anyone from a Muslim family background who thinks differently, even vehemently opposes Islamic fascism, is seen as a traitor to his or her culture, not only by Islamists, but also by the advocates of identity politics in the West. Such positions are presented by intellectuals who themselves do not live under Sharia law or want to wear the headscarf. They do not even receive praise from the Islamists for their ideological advocacy. Western advertising for religious coercion appears as a free gift to the jihadists. When Judith Butler honored Hamas and Hezbollah in 2006 as part of the progressive left, there was no jubilation to be heard in Gaza or Beirut. Of course, Hamas and Hezbollah are happy about any propagandistic support, but the one who loves the betrayal does not necessarily love the traitor. For the societies of the Middle East from Tel Aviv to Tehran, between Tunis and Islamabad, the appropriate political positioning today means a matter of life and death. At least on this, many people in the region would certainly agree. Nobody can afford a policy, quote, in the name of the other, end quote, as it is advanced by Western cultural relativism. Western democracies in the 20th century have only once relatively spontaneously formed an alliance in a joint ideological opposition. In the dispute with the Soviet Union about the heritage of secular enlightenment. Hitler, on the other hand, forced the West into an anti-fascist alliance, which Europe would have liked to avoid, as it does today concerning a confrontation with Islamism. The biggest question marks lay therefore today in Europe. In case a reversal of the so-called cultural dialogue and collaboration with Islamism would be possible, the question of alliances is almost self-evident. It is not about a struggle between ethno-religiously defined cultures, but about a confrontation with identity politics. And that is why the first and most experienced partners of any willing political forces in the West for an alliance against barbarism are not politicians who want to contain Islamism only within Islamism's supposedly ancestral region. Instead, any meaningful and enduring partnership for a better future in the Middle East and the West should be built with the dissidents of Islamist identity politics on the one hand and the Jews and Israelis affected by their anti-Semitic consequences on the other. And that's the end of the piece. And there's a description of the author here. Andreas Benl is Senior Fellow and Head of Iran Research at the Middle East Freedom Forum Berlin. His research is focused on the encounters of political, social, and intellectual movements in Iran, the Middle East and the West, Islamism and anti-Semitism on the one hand, the quest for freedom and emancipation on the other. Among many other publications, he is co-author of the anthologies Iran, Israel, Deutschland, Antisemitismus, Außenhandel und Atomprogramm, published in 2017, Iran in Weltsystem, Innsbruck 2010, and Der Iran, Analyse einer islamischen Diktatur und ihrer europäischen Förderer, published in 2008. Thank you so much for listening.